I'm Dr. Mark Hatala, and I want to welcome you to my office. I'm a cognitive scientist who studies time travel by replicating days from the past. So everything that someone who was alive on a particular day would be exposed to, from early morning newspapers through late night television, and everything in between. Now, the day that we're talking about in this video is February 9th, 1964. That's my George Harrison imitation there, which is the night that the Beatles made their first appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show. And the topic of our video is the news magazines from that week. So Newsweek and Time. Let's get started with Newsweek. And so we have Charles de Gaulle on the cover, and the question is, France, a return to greatness? 60 years later, the answer remains still no. But there are some interesting articles in this particular edition that I want to talk about. One deals with the murderer of Medgar Evers. Now, Medgar Evers was a civil rights leader, and he was the president of the Mississippi NAACP, and he was murdered in his driveway by I can't remember his name. It doesn't matter. It's better if we forget his name. But yeah, he was walking into his house, and his murderer shot him in the back while his wife and 3 children were waiting for him to get home from work. It went to trial, and it was an all-white jury, and they acquitted him. It was a 7-5 vote that he was guilty. And so they had a second trial. That was also a hung jury, and then he was eventually convicted in 1994 by a mixed jury, and he died in prison. So there's that. The second article I want to talk about, the rest of the time really we're going to be talking about science. Don't fence him in. Now, this was a conference where they had people, researchers, get together and talk about the state of the family in 1964. And one of the researchers, Russell Lee, says that monogamous marriage is a bizarre and unnatural state, and that men, it's often a cage which confines freedom-loving men. So it's the misogyny and sexism in this article is through the roof. But it's worth reading because, again, as I've talked about in other videos, the divorce rate in the early 1960s was skyrocketing, and people didn't really know why it was happening. And so that's interesting too. Our third article is called The Year of the Transplant, and it talks specifically about things like kidney transplants. But the previous month, there was a guy named James Hardy who was a doctor, and this was incredibly controversial. He transplanted it's the first heart transplant, but he did it with a chimpanzee heart, and he did it without the consent of the patient. The patient lived for, I believe, 18 hours after the transplant, never regained consciousness. But Dr. Hardy thought that he had done something pretty incredible, and he had 4 attending physicians at the time. One refused to participate in it. Another just nodded agreement that he would go along with it, and 2 of them said yes, that they would help. But the blowback from this was pretty incredible. Now, in our time, the use of essentially animal organs as transplants is pretty commonplace, especially in terms of heart valves and that sort of thing. But at the time, or 1964, it was much more controversial. And again, Dr. Hardy, he tried to present his results at a conference later in the year, and basically he was booed and jeered by the crowd. So let's talk about Time magazine too. And it has Marina Oswald on the cover because they're interested in the Warren Commission, because they were studying the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And so let me talk about the Oswalds for a moment too, because This is a long-form article, especially for Time magazine, about Marina Oswald and Lee Harvey Oswald's mother, Marguerite. One of the things that, it tells the story a lot from their perspective too. And one of the things that Marguerite says is that everyone feels sympathy for Mrs. Kennedy, but why doesn't anybody feel bad for me? Well, because her son murdered the president. I think that's probably the reason why. A second article is about the Top Pop Mop Tops, which is the Beatles. It's some permutation of Top Mop Pop thing. But they were greeted at JFK Airport by thousands and thousands of screaming fans, and it gets into why they're so popular. What the Beatles said themselves is it was due to their press agents, and they had 17 of them. The last article also involves the Beatles, and or at least they mention them in passing. It is the findings of behavioral science, essentially written so that everybody can understand them. And it's so interesting to me, as a behavioral scientist, a cognitive scientist, how much of this stuff has subsequently changed. And it reminds me, it's an old Garrison Keillor joke, where it's a professor, a psychology professor, and a parent of one of his students comes up to him and says, you know, I took your class 30 years ago, and my child brought home their test, and I noticed that you're still asking the same questions. And the professor says, yes, but now all the answers are different. And that gives you some sense of psychological research. So, for example, one of the things that they say is a truth is that family IQ increases the more children that you have. So that firstborns are the least intelligent, and then each subsequent child is more intelligent. We believe the exact opposite now. There's an idea of what's called family IQ, that oldest children and only children also, tend to have the highest IQs because they have the most one-on-one time with the parents. By the time you get to later born children, they're essentially being raised by their peers and their older siblings, or at least they're having a lot more contact with them. And so they have lower IQs. Another finding, what's another one I want to talk about here? Is that creative work is best done by people in their 30s. Now, people like Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg would probably disagree with this because they all dropped out of college in their teens and early 20s to start their own companies like Apple, Microsoft, and Facebook. What they're really trying to get, I teach a class in evolutionary psychology, and what they're really trying to get at is what are called human universals. And so characteristics which show up in all human societies. One of the things they also talk about is, this would go against Dr. Lee's teaching, but the idea that premarital sex is present in all human societies, and it's generally discouraged. And affairs are absolutely discouraged. But what they don't talk about this in this article, but that I always found interesting, is that contract murder takes place in every human society that they've studied. So again, delegate work to other people. Don't do it yourself. So I will put links to all of these below so you can read them for yourself. But while you're at timetravelsimplified.com, why not become a time traveler and buy my book, Beatles in America, February 9th, 1964. It's guaranteed. Our motto is, it's time travel or it's free. I also put a link below to my Patreon account if you'd like to support my research further. And I ask you to like and subscribe and share this video. And otherwise, have a great day.